Hello all, welcome to this webinar on financial planning for Microsoft Azure. Today's agenda, we're going to just run through real quickly, just understand what Microsoft Cloud Services are and what type of impact they're going to have on budgets and they're having on budgets, I guess. Understanding that cloud strategy so that it can help you start budgeting for Azure and when to start budgeting. And then we'll start getting comfortable with that OpEx model, understanding the pay-as-you-go costs. And then we can cost analyze some potential services, look at what we need to think about when we're looking at the services from a financial perspective. And once we're in that cloud environment, let's have a look at ways that we can monitor that spend. At the end, we'll wrap it up with ways of getting started. So just a little bit about myself. I'm Ken Kaban. I'm Technical Services Director at PowerON Platforms. I've been in the IT industry for a number of years now, running different size technical teams. So the financial planning has been always something that's close to what I do. I'd like to think that I'm a pragmatic and hands-on approacher to the way we solve problems, take that strategy and vision and turn it into an implementation plan. You can always find me on ken.caban at poweronplatforms.com or visit our website to see some of the services that we do. And just on that, a little bit about what we do. We're a Microsoft Gold partner and EMS Elite partner, and also got some MVP status within the organization. There's two core parts to our business. There's the services side, and then there's the product side. On the services side, we're pretty much very heavily focused on the Windows 10 System Center stack of products. We spend a lot on the Microsoft's Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite, and very strongly focus on Azure, especially the operational management side. On the product side, we have developed our own products that help you deploy and manage your Windows 10 environments and monitor your critical servers. And we've also scripted and automated a lot of the manual processes around deploying a lot of the System Center products. We've worked in a number of organizations, whether it be from councils to NHS to large corporate environments. So we've got a lot of experience in there. Right, so let's start the webinar. Okay, before we understand the financials, let's just get a quick primer on what Microsoft Azure is for those that aren't too familiar with it. If you think of a computer room or a data center, you can always think of the computers, the servers, the racks, the power, the cooling, that bottom layer where the essential services are required to build on top of. So think of the Azure data centers that are built around globally, and these numbers are growing. There's a very large number of them. Think of those core data center services where the servers, racks, cooling, electricity, and all that is supplied. On top of that bottom layer, we then start layering in the infrastructure that we need on there. So these are the computers, the storage, the networking that we need to implement. Once we've got that base, we call this the IaaS, the infrastructure as a service layer. Once we've enabled those, we can then start putting in things like the technologies on top of that. So we've got the platforms, which could be the web, the data, the analytics, etc. And then there's the components on the left and the right-hand side. The left-hand side is all about that security and management, the identity, automation bits as well. But the right-hand side is what makes Microsoft Azure data centers unique. Microsoft have been in the IT game for well over 20 years now for enterprise organizations. And there's an equivalent product that is not only in the cloud, but there's also an on-prem equivalent like Windows Server, etc. So the hybrid capability of Microsoft's Azure cloud services are quite unique that other vendors don't necessarily provide or cannot provide the breadth of. So a lot of organizations are really taking Microsoft's Azure data center services seriously because there's that ability to scale out into the cloud at a time when it suits them. So this is what the data center capabilities, and you can see there's a lot of technology there that's been provided. But not only is it the technology, but Microsoft also have a lot of compliances that they go through. So this is from regional levels all the way through to industry to global levels. You can see things like ISO 27001 in the top left-hand corner basically defines that they're patched and updated and they're regression tested and the firewalls are secure. You can see the NHS Information Governance Toolkit for the UK. So there's a lot of components that that Microsoft go through. Even the UKG cloud is in here, as you can see in the bottom left. So you can see that the data center services or the Azure cloud services are really taken seriously now by a lot of industries, a lot of businesses worldwide and in the UK. And I mentioned that hybrid and an open environment. So the hybrid capabilities is one of the critical things, and IT departments are really taking that seriously because take, for example, common identity. We can use our on-premise computer credentials, so our email address and our computer password, to sign into things like Salesforce or Box. I think there's thousands of applications that we can control and monitor through that common identity. Not only that, as you can see, it's not a closed environment, so there's a lot of different non-Microsoft technologies that are supported in this Azure environment. Again, this gives the IT business, IT and business, a lot of opportunity to be creative in the ways they approach business solutions. So in a nutshell, if we were to just understand that in a nutshell, basically Microsoft's Azure is an open and flexible cloud environment. And the key thing here is that it enables you to build quickly and deploy technology and solutions that's in a global network. Those data centers at the bottom layer, you can see you've got the core things like your networking, your storage, your compute, and on top of that, you then can build on your app services. Key thing to understand here is that it's a usage-based service, so you pay for what you use. And all the governance and the SLAs and the patching and all that is taken care of. So from an impact to your budgets, that pay-as-you-use really has that different mindset that we need to think about. So we need to, first of all, I guess, understand what IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS are. So infrastructure as a service is that core layer of the servers, the storage, etc. This is your traditional IT departments who'd come in and require, IT services, servers to be built, etc. On top of those infrastructure services, they would then install the software, the websites, the databases, etc. PaaS is where you take away that server layer and you just look after the application layer. So you still patch and manage and maintain the applications, but you don't care about the operating system, which is taken care of by another entity. So in a computer, or I suppose in an office environment, this is where you're looking more along the virtualization technologies, where the servers are managed by IT and the applications are managed by the business. Where we're seeing the trends in IT are going is towards SaaS, where it's software as a service, where we don't even manage and patch and maintain the software. That is all taken care of us for us, and we just consume it. So things like Salesforce, for example, things like Exchange Online or Office 365 are very strong examples of this. This does have an impact to our CapEx, and we need to understand this because in the traditional sense, we're always looking for a big chunk of money up front and then petering off the usage of that or the costs of that as we go. So predicting that usage and trying to understand the forecasting of what we're going to need and what we're going to use becomes the challenge. The other challenges you need to think about and the impact to your budget is a migrate versus a rebuild type of opportunity. So do we just lift and shift what we've got here from location A into the cloud, or is this an opportune time to rebuild it to the newer technologies, or do we time our migrations to a rebuild? And what does that impact financially? Does that mean we need new skills to do the rebuilding? Do we need training? Will that have an impact to the business? Operational expenditure does have this unique ability for us to look at what business entities are costing us, what services are costing us on a monthly basis. We can look at chargebacks. We can do showbacks as well. So it does often offer us some financial views on how we analyze that information. And of course, when we're looking at these impacts, it's not just about moving into Azure and sitting in there. We need to factor in the technological change, the way things are done now in Azure. So business and IT change and the costs of that. A great example of this would be if you decide to use Azure for disaster recovery scenarios, do we need an external DR site? Example, SunGuard, or would DR be sufficient to be able to say work from home in those scenarios? And what's the change of costs for that? And what's the change of training people or giving them laptops to work from home, etc.? Okay, so let's take a little bit about understanding our cloud strategy so that it makes sense moving forward. Now, cloud strategy is quite important from a financial perspective, but we need to ask those basic questions. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? When, the how, when we need to engage, and when the business needs help. So if we look at a bit more in depth of what are we doing, this from a financial perspective will tell us what the goal is or what the motivation is financially. Are we trying to eliminate the data center? Are we transforming the way we do things? Are we trying to modernize or introduce a new way of working? Are we trying to reduce that capital expenditure, or are we trying to deploy something like a business continuity or disaster recovery strategy? This obviously leads into the why. And again, this tells us if we're trying to save money, if we're trying to react to something, are we trying to keep up? Have we outgrown? So it's not always about saving money. It's about understanding where we're spending the money and why we're spending it. Is it to give us more capability as a business? Is it to give us the ability to develop new products, etc., solutions quicker? And again, the reason why it's important to understand why to make plans is to understand what your goals are. To put this into a simple analogy, with these bits of technology, and I've shown you earlier what the Azure components look like. If you think of them as rooms in a house, we don't want the business or IT department to be developing rooms without that overall arching plan of what the house needs to look like. Without understanding the house, we won't understand what type of electricity we need to run across the rooms. We won't understand what plumbing and where it should be. So those plans are quite important. And also understanding the current environment helps you map out. So you can see from this little example here that taking something that's the current and looking at the future of it and where it is and how it's going to be gives us an idea of a plan and identifies dependencies, the order of things you need to do, etc. And that drives us further into the understanding that implementation roadmap. And this is essential for financial planning. So we need to understand, I mean, these phases could be quarters, years, etc. But it gives the business, IT, and financial planners the ability to see where we need to make the spend, what we need to achieve during that phase, and the effort that it's going to take. Okay, so we've covered the importance of making those plans, but when do we start budgeting for it? Now, typically, budgets are done once a year, but that doesn't mean that we should be mapping out our budgets once a year and trying to think and forecast a year ahead. I believe that the budgeting process should be an ongoing process that we factor in. We might summarize it and we might categorize it once a year when budgets are due, but we should always be looking at mapping that information out, getting it ready. So when there is, at the board level buy-in, when there's things like applications that need to be refreshed, etc. These are the common things, looking at those business events. And you can see on the example there, mapping out a timeline when hardware is going to, or software is going to basically come to its life cycle end. These are times when we need to map out and understand what the future costs are going to be. And it's a great opportunity for us to see, what we need going forward, and what we need to do, whether it's still an IaaS solution that's required on premise, etc. So we should start budgeting as and when we've identified opportunities that we could potentially utilize or refresh things. We should be looking at the cloud, a potential way of either doing it differently, doing it in a modern way, doing it where we're decomplicating our own environment, or we're trying to save costs. Now, I believe that you should plan for those costs early. And what I mean by that is that there'll be a business case. Usually a business case is looked at and try and analyzed fairly early in the project. So this is where you can look at the total cost of ownership of that project. And you can look at the performance analysis. And of course, we seem to do a lot of those cost comparisons if we put it here or what there. Now, when we're doing the business case, we're trying to obviously plan estimated costs, but the real understanding of the technology and the product gives us that idea when we're doing these small proof of concepts. We need to factor in when we're doing those proof of concepts that cost to scale. So building out a small SharePoint farm and then factoring the cost to scale that service should be in our costings. So when we're seeing these plans, we're going to build X, Y, and Z in the cloud, should be asking, well, okay, are we going to scale that? When's the scale due? Has that been factored into the life cycle? And don't forget the cost of deploying this technology. So it's not just about deploying the technology into a server environment, but the change to the business. Will they need new ways of working? Will they need to be require new technology, newer systems, Windows 10 upgrades, etc.? And what about the change required to the IT staff? Will they need to learn new things, learn to support these new things? So factor in those initial costs as well. Make sure that those are in your plans at the early stage. Now there's some there's some additional costs about putting technology into the cloud. And we need to think about these additional costs, and these are good reminders to ask these additional questions, like licensing. Have we utilized them? Are we utilizing them? Do we need operating system if we're going an IaaS? If we're going to a new software version, etc.? What are the license costs and the implications of that, of doing that in the cloud? One of the challenges that I've mentioned earlier is predicting that usage and spend. So if it's a pay-as-you-use service, how are we predicting what we're going to use? Now, one of the things over here is the simplest things you can do with these type of usage plans is to understand if there's a scale involved over a number of years for this service and factor that in. So we plan to do a small deployment this year. So it's £1,000 a month for that. Then we're going to roll it out to a majority of the business in year 2, and we expect that to be a growth of factor of 3. So it's £3,000 a month. And then we're going to start offering this to our customers and clients in year 3, and we expect that to be a factor of 5. So we can already budget and work out that it's 12,000 this year, 36,000, etc., etc. So predicting that usage and spend is quite important, especially if you've got scalability factored in. Don't forget the cost of securing and monitoring your environment. So a lot of people just stick a server in there, but it's still a data center. You still need to look after it. And even if it's an application, you still need to monitor it, that it's running efficiently and effectively. Now, you need to keep an eye out on unmanaged and untagged resources. These are basically servers or services or databases or technology that IT team might have spun up, or people might have spun up, and they're finished with it, but it's sitting there. So, the cloud environment is so easy to build servers, but because you're being charged for using them, you need to be able to monitor them. So if you tag your resources and say, this is part of project XYZ, this is part of the SharePoint farm, this bit of technology here is part of the finance department, then when new technology comes up, you can see where they're supposed to be and tag it. High availability, again, when we're looking at on-premise, we usually have multiple data centers or multiple computer rooms. When we're looking at in the cloud, it's no different. Are we going to build a duplicate of this? Are we going to create high availability for it? Does that mean we need to double up the costs for these services? And of course, just because you've got a server or service in the cloud doesn't mean that it's not backed up. You'll need to back up and think of that disaster recovery capability, the ability to restore that data, the ability to recover that information and rebuild it. And of course, lifecycle management. So don't just think, okay, I've got it there. Here is the, unless you're going for a SaaS solution, anything that's a PaaS or an IaaS type of solution means that I have to think about the operating system. I have to think about the application. I have to think about the lifecycle of that. If a new version comes out by the vendor, how am I going to upgrade for that? Will that mean a change to the business as well, the way they use software? So don't forget these additional costs when you factor in that business case. Don't forget these additional costs when you're in the cloud. They should be the standard type of costs. They don't go away because they're in Azure. Okay, and of course, think of that life cycle. So just as a recap, okay, just a recap on the previous conversations. Identify your goals and analyze, cost analyze. So what are we doing? Are we migrating? Are we doing backups? Are we there for efficiency? Is there for, we're trying to scale out capabilities for our business? So cost analyze, does it make sense to put it into Azure? Does it make sense to keep it on premise? What are the tangible and also what are the intangible benefits? So once we've done that, we can structure and build out our plan. And that means that we can work out our budgets. We can work out a time frame, what money we're going to need, when we're going to implement those, and what systems, services, dependencies, availability costs, the hidden things that I've mentioned that need to be built. And don't forget that once you're in that environment, it's not just cut and dry. This should be the same for on-prem, is that you need to look at reducing existing costs. So does that mean that if we put this into Azure that we're going to get rid of something on premise? If we're going hybrid, does that mean we're going to have less of this capability or less of these number of servers on premise? If we set up automation, things like automation regarding scalability of the service, does that mean that when it's not peaking, that we don't necessarily have to pay massive amounts of money and only pay when the systems are busy, which means that they'll automatically scale? And of course, things to report and optimize that environment for us. Anything that we can do to understand that. What you're seeing there on that table is sort of like what I'd expect to see from my IT teams when they're building out these type of services, so I can understand high availability, load balancing, recovery time objectives for these technologies. And it gives us an idea of that they've thought of these components, they've factored that into their costs, etc. Okay, so let's try and get to grips with some of the things around OpEx costs, this ongoing pay-as-you-use type of things, and some thoughts around that. So first things is that for larger organizations, you most likely have an enterprise agreement. So this is quite interesting because what you're doing there is you're paying upfront. So you're paying a CapEx cost for something that you're consuming that's pay-as-you-use. So CapEx for an OpEx model, it's quite interesting. So we've got a lot of customers that will pay and fork out, an X amount of money, £50,000, but then they need to do something with it over the next 3 years. So make sure that if you are in this type of scenario, that there is that plan that I've mentioned earlier. There is that structure of what we're going to do with it, how you're going to utilize your enterprise agreement or the license if you've paid for. So when it comes to enterprise agreements, make sure that you've worked out with your IT teams that there's a plan of usage for it. And again, that per user licensing, especially around the Microsoft 365 products, there's a lot of CALs that you get for it. So especially on the Azure platform, the Windows Server CALs usually. So try and understand what CALs you get, etc., and identify similar services that you're using. If you are using, for example, Microsoft 365 or Office 365, what currently do you have that is a similar service that you can switch off or depreciate over time and get rid of and start utilizing these licenses that you're paying for? And again, one of the final bits there is to understand the importance of size. So on-premise, whether it's a virtual machine or physical machine, we would normally build a server or service to the maximum capacity that we envision it's going to have during its lifetime. So if we think, the business comes to us and says, we've got this great website, we're going to expect 1 million people to hit that website in a couple of years' time, we would build out the technology and the storage and the capabilities in the back end to handle 1 million website hits. Now that server or service would sit there for 18 months while it waits for that scale. But in the cloud, that's wasted money because it's sitting there doing nothing. So pay for what you use and understand that you can scale it up or scale it out is very important. And having that into your financial planning as well. So if you have sort of like a business scale, scalability regarding, expected forecasted growth, etc., should be factored into your budgets as well. Now, Microsoft have got some tools that can help you with some of your calculations, and this is something that you can work out with your IT teams, etc. One of these things is the TCO calculator, and I've provided the link there. Now, when it comes to TCO analysis, I take these with a grain of salt, obviously. But one of the interesting things about this TCO calculator is that you can actually export into Excel and you can customize the values. And I think that's quite important because we can put in our own values and get our own details on it. The thing about this TCO analysis is though, is not so much the numerical values, but the components that go to creating it. So that factors in the whole life cycle, and then it'll prompt you and you'll actually think about, have I thought about the storage? Have I thought about the IT labor? And we can then use that as a comparison to our current CapEx models. Are we factoring all these components in right now? So this is a great way of understanding, what a product or a service is going to be over a life cycle for us. So it's quite a handy tool, especially at the business case level, to understand the benefits. There's a couple of other tools. So the one that most IT departments should know in and out and should be very comfortable is the Azure pricing calculator. This is basically where you can go and pull out the costs of every single item in the Azure portfolio, work out the costs, work out the different data center costs and how much it would put. You can literally build the whole service, the storage, the network capacity, the bandwidth it's going to require, the type of VMs or apps you're going to need, and you can work out the whole detailed pricing estimate with the pricing calculator. Not only that, there's a lot of third-party products out there that have integrated into the APIs of this pricing model, and they can give you a lot of benefits. One of those products that has done that, and Microsoft have bought them out, is called Azure Cost Management. And Azure Cost Management is about monitoring the spend of your Azure. So this is once you're in the environment, and I'll run you through this a little bit later on, but it's quite important to understand that once you're in there, you want to be able to monitor it, but not just monitor, be able to alert and set reports and access information, not just from a technical perspective, but from a financial perspective. If you're expecting the monthly cost to be £1,000, and all of a sudden someone's built up a massive, gigantic server that's another £1,000 on its own, and your spend has gone up to £2,000, well, I want to know about that as soon as possible. So those type of capabilities already exist in the Azure environment. So again, these type of tools will help you understand that OpEx model, the monthly billing type of cycle. It'll help you work out at the planning stage and once you're in that environment to keep an eye on it. And it should be quite useful. Okay, I'd like to just give you some potential understanding of things that we can look at, potential services and what we can use so we can cost analyze potential services that we can move to the cloud. And to do that, just want to show you the evolution of IT services as we're seeing it. So what you're seeing over here is the classic model of doing things, moving across that hybrid world and that modern IT that you've probably heard about, and where the future is going. All of these components don't need to necessarily know the details of it, but what it's doing is basically going from an on-premise type of classical mindset leading to that hybrid, and where it makes sense, the modern future is focused more about doing it in a cloud type of world. So it's important to understand that things like storage, for example, in the old days, we used to store these on our file servers, etc. And I say that old days because we're seeing a lot of people nowadays using a mix of online and local storage. So they'll store it on their laptop, they'll store it on their corporate file server, etc. But a lot of customers that are on, say, Office 365, etc., are moved to SharePoint and OneDrive. We're also starting to see file servers, etc. there. But you can see that mindset is shifting to a more cloud side of things, and that's because it's not just about cost, but it's about intangible benefits as well. A lot of the backups, for example, these days, there's a very strong business case to put backups into the cloud. So you can see from the evolution of IT services that we're going to this cloud world, and people are really adopting this quite favorably. And if we look at the cost analysis of these are those type of scenarios where Azure itself, the infrastructure, what makes sense. On the left-hand side, where we've got things that we might switch on and off. And traditionally, you might think, well, you know, there's not much that we switch on and off. But if we think creatively, if your business doesn't work over the weekends, does the service need to be on for certain things? If you've got a financial application that's only accessed once a month, or you run the report on it once a month, does it need to be on for the rest of the month? So the on and off model workloads, etc., is quite interesting in understanding that a cloud type environment could definitely save you some costs there. Growing fast, now I've mentioned this several times about that scalability, where you build it and you expect the growth for it, right? But when you do this, please make sure that you factor into that OpEx cost model the growth of the cost of that technology as well. Now, predictable and unpredictable bursting, this is exactly what Azure is designed for, where you expect or you don't expect massive spikes in usage, etc. But the environment is perfect for that. And these are obviously going back to our strategic goals. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to reduce costs? Are we trying to provide an agile IT, which is providing an agile business? Or is it strategic opportunities where we're offering services to consumers, to businesses, to customers, etc.? So new ways of thinking, that flexibility is provided in there. So there's a lot of opportunity that we can look at that. And the way we want to look at and analyze that, I've mentioned earlier, is to start at the early planning, understand how we can break that down to a proof of concept, and factor in these type of components. Can we go on and off with it, etc.? Do we expect to scale with it? Will it be predictable, or will it have a bursting type of scenario as well for it? Now here's some examples of those. So here's some scenario examples that you can see the technologies. Now we don't necessarily need to go into detail. I'll cover a couple of them, but backup is a great one. So if you've got archival information, archival video footage, for example, DR, backups of your servers, etc. Going to tape and storing that tape for 5 to 7 years or 10 years could be quite a challenge. I've personally lived through the scenario where we've tried to restore a tape from 5 years ago and we can't, simply because the tape drive doesn't support the older tapes anymore. So, and the software has deprecated. So having these into cloud where the costs are significantly reducing, and then being able to restore these in a matter of minutes, not days, is a big factor. So that intangible benefit for backups is a massive driver. Then you can see, for example, the lift and shifts. So if we're looking at app modernization, if we're looking at things that we're doing currently in our organization, and we can't really touch those because they're critical, etc. But if we were to build a parallel environment next to it, it could cost us in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, to build that parallel environment before we test it out and see it. Well, we could literally do that and modernize that whole thing in an Azure environment and develop that back-end services, the database, etc., the traffic management, the load balancing, so that modernizing our environment could definitely be and is one of the top solutions that Azure is used for. We do a lot of concepts around refreshing the Active Directory and doing and testing out things that we're unsure of. But you can see where it goes to, where we're going into the the CRM, the ERP systems. It's all going there, and then taking that and putting the BI side of it. So we do again a lot of that data platform, taking that databases and analyzing that data into automation-based workloads, So starters, levers, movers, processes, etc., like that. So we see a lot of these solutions, and when we're cost comparing these type of solutions, we've got the TCO Analysis tool, we've got the pricing calculator, we've made up our plans and understand our structure. We want to know a life cycle. When do we do this? So there's no point doing the business analytics and AI by your IT teams if they haven't built out the core systems yet to pull that data from. So if you don't have access to that information, how are we going to do that first? So getting that logical structure and plan is quite important. Okay, the final thing that I want to cover is about monitoring that spend. So it's not just about at the planning stage and the business case stage and the proof of concept stage. It's also once you're in that environment, and this is probably just as important, if not more important. So Microsoft, as I mentioned earlier, has provided a product called Azure Cost Management. It's free for all Azure customers. So this will allow you to analyze and cost control. So you can see your spend, you can create budgets in this environment, and you can send up alerts and notifications along with reporting. So it's quite a powerful tool that you can use to get some details and insights about your spend. Now that visibility, that dashboard, doesn't have to be, it's not necessarily an IT thing. As you can see, we can create management dashboards here for different type of people. And so we can have an operational or a financial view. We can have a top level view. How much are we spending on our Azure environment, all in a single pane of glass, and you can see across the full stack where the money's being spent. We can also set up an actual versus budget type of thing. So if you're looking at if you look at this type of example, you can easily see where we spiked our spend. So if we're expecting our cost to be less than say $3,000 or pounds a month, and we had a spike, we can see where that was. Well, more importantly, we can drill down into that. So we can create alerts, we can create thresholds. So if we create subscriptions of Azure for different departments, we can set and create a budget for them and then monitor that in detail. And of course, I mentioned earlier about tagging and untagging resources. If we tag our resources and get our IT teams to make sure that they structure their Azure environment properly, we can then see, oh, this resource is for department XYZ. These services are here for the SharePoint farm, etc. And this will identify, what unallocated tags we got, what we haven't assigned, and start accounting for those and charging departments, etc. So you can see that we can do things in detail as well. This is just giving you an idea of how you could see by technology, or by department. We're using a lot of, for example, servers or databases in our production environment. Most of our costs are going to VMs, etc. So we can drill down and get a better understanding of our environment. There's also things like sizing and optimization that really come into the mix, so we can utilize and monitor those resources. So in this scenario, we're seeing which servers are less than a certain percentage of CPU, and this can then read into a report that basically tells us to scale that server down or save money from it. So we can identify the peaks and troughs and look to automate them, or it could be a manual process where we shut them down or shrink them down because we're using, say, 8-core 32 gig of RAM system, but it's only a 10% utilization. So we could save a lot of money just by shrinking that down because it's not being utilized. And then that obviously helps you identify those lingering costs as well. So if systems have been shut down or decommissioned, has the IT team, have the people removed and deleted all the components from it? So disks, IPs, components of that cloud, that's those lingering costs that aren't really attached to anything, you can report on that as well. So that the cost management tool from Azure is quite a powerful tool in helping you manage and keep an eye on your OpEx costs in the cloud. Okay, so getting started. How do we get started with all this? So first of all, let's just take some key takeaways from this, okay? So some key messages there. Look, IT services, as we see it, evolving into this pay-as-you-use model. We are starting to see a lot of IT departments saying, well, I don't want to manage infrastructure. I don't want to have to build a complicated on-prem environment. I don't need to think about disaster recovery and high availability. So everything is trying to go towards this SaaS-based model. And then, so even though everything is going towards that model, you need to understand, and business needs to understand what they can benefit from right now. So it's not just a one-off exercise, but it's something that you'll do, a couple of times a year, is to understand where we can utilize it and benefit, especially if you have signed an enterprise agreement or you've got some sort of licensing agreement. Make sure that you understand how you can benefit for what you've paid for. Traditionally, CapEx costs have always been about capital. In the modern world, you will still have CapEx costs, but those CapEx costs will be more about implementation, business change, consultancy or services to deploy, etc. Your OpEx costs will be impacted, so don't think about your OpEx cost is going to be linear across the life cycle of a product or a service, especially if there's scale to think about, especially if there's a number of users and the business growth or business shrinking, etc. Those will impact your OpEx costs. So don't just automatically assume I'm paying £1,000 a month for this. I expect to pay £1,000 for the month for the next 5 years of the life cycle of this thing. So again, the key thing there is make sure that your budgets are aligned with some plans. If you don't see a plan by your IT team, well, what is it that they're doing and how are they budgeting for this? How are they putting some structure around that work? So the key takeaways, make sure you structure it, plan it, CapEx it, and understand it well. Now, as a follow-up, we at PowerON, we do regular webinars and blog series, so you can always touch base with us. We do a lot of these type of planning sessions. We do solution alignment on these technologies and help understand and help businesses drive out the business case, the TCO analysis, the proof of concept, etc. We pretty much get you started, so we can lead on, and we can even do personal sessions with yourselves. From a financials perspective, if you don't already have a trial for Azure or EM&S, these type of cloud-based technologies, you should. They're quite available online. Those three calculators that I mentioned from a financials perspective, you should, we recommend that you just have a test drive and get familiar with those type of technologies and make sure that they're used in the right place at the right time. So thanks for listening to webinar on Azure Financials, and hope to see you in the next one.